Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're delighted to be hosting this discussion of Joe Fewsmith's new book, Rethinking Chinese Politics. My name is Jude Blanchette, and I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS, and I'm delighted to be co-hosting this event with my colleague Scott Kennedy, the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics. This is a fortuitous timing for this event because right now we're seeing a host of actions and behavior coming out of China's regulatory and political system that is frankly, for a lot of us, just bewildering. We've just had the announcement of the 6th plenum, and along with that, attendant rumors that we might be seeing a third resolution on party history. We've got the 20th Party Congress coming up next year, where Xi Jinping will likely take a third term as General Secretary, which would formally and finally eradicate discussion about norms of a Chinese leader only serving 2 5-year terms. And while I suspect many observers of Chinese politics, casual or otherwise, will be surprised if Xi Jinping takes a third term, our main speaker today will likely not be one of them. And as he argues in this fantastic new book, we have long overestimated the degree of institutionalization in China's political system and underestimated the importance of Leninism as an organizing feature of the Communist Party of China. So many, of course, will know Professor Joe Fewsmith as one of the wisest and most experienced observers of Chinese politics since the 1980s. And he's profoundly shaped how I think about China's political system and the Communist Party. So we're really delighted to have him today. But we're also thrilled to be welcoming Professor Jessica Teets of Middlebury College, who has carved out a position, I think, as one of the leading analysts looking at and tracking evolutions in China's governance system. And she really sits at the cutting edge of this. So we're delighted to have Jessica joining us for comments after we hear from Professor Fewsmith. So with that, I'd like to get right into it. But first, just a quick logistics note. The order of the program is I'm going to shut up in a minute and turn it over to Joe, who will talk for about 15 or 20 minutes and run through the main arguments of this book. After that, my colleague Scott Kennedy will take over and invite Jessica to join the discussion. This is meant to be, given the limitations of a virtual event, nonetheless participatory, mass democracy, so to speak. So at any point, folks can be sending questions and comments to us via the event page at csis.org. Just go to events, look for this specific event page, and you'll see a button that you can click. And indeed, we've already got questions coming in. We'll try to weave those in to the discussion when Joe wraps up his comments. So again, thanks to everyone for joining us. This is going to be a great discussion. And with that, with this, I'd like to turn it over to Comrade Fewsmith for the next 20 or so minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Jude. Very kind introduction, and it's wonderful to be at CSIS, however virtually it might be. At any case, as Jude said, the book is, and the reason to write the book is really because I think that the thesis of institutionalization of Chinese politics has been overplayed over the recent years. Just one example, and I'm going to pick on a non-China specialist just because he sums up the case so well. Milan Zvolik, a prominent political scientist at Yale, wrote, while Xi Jinping was still heir apparent, he wrote that he would be expected to serve no more than 2 5-year terms and be accountable to a set of institutions within the Communist Party of China that carefully balanced 2 major political coalitions, as well as regional and organizational interests within the Chinese political system. Now, I'm really not picking on Professor Zvolik because he's not, as I say, a China specialist, but I do think he was summing up what a lot of prominent China specialists were writing and thinking about that time. And I think it's now obvious, and probably will become more obvious in about a year after the 20th Party Congress, that China is nowhere near as institutionalized as his rather optimistic prediction suggested. It's really not an institutionalized authoritarian system. It's a Leninist system, and Leninist systems are dominated by mobilizational parties, not by institutions that constrain power. I have to say one word about institutionalization, because I think what institutionalization does, I think we can go on to the next slide, is that it's really a decision-making rule, at least for elite politics. It's a decision-making rule about how power passes from one leader to another. And if you don't have those rules, the succession can be messy. And power really needs to be consolidated by each leader. When you take over the position of general secretary, you're not inheriting a number of institutions, you're inheriting a number of relationships, and you have to figure out how to consolidate power. Just a quick mental experiment. Just imagine that you were dropped into the chair of the general secretary after a party congress. You'd kind of look around the room, and you'd see some friendly faces and a lot of perhaps not so friendly faces. And you have to figure out, how do you keep power? How do you consolidate power? For those of you who've been watching China for a while, you remember that Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang were not able to consolidate power. They fell along the way, and certainly when Jiang Zemin took over in 1989, I certainly recall a lot of people saying he'll never be able to consolidate power. He did, and that's part of the story. And each leader either consolidates power or doesn't. So how do you do this? Well, I think you start by looking around and identifying the really critical positions. Not all positions are created equal. Some are much more important than others. And, just in observing Chinese politics, the military is certainly one of those that you need to have control of. And Jiang Zemin certainly did not have control of the military when he took over. He had zero military experience, had worked in no military-related industries or anything of that nature. And by all accounts, the Yang brothers, Yang Shangkun, Yang Baibing, were not so welcoming to him. And this is where Deng Xiaoping gave Jiang Zemin a lot of support. In 1992, after the 14th Party Congress, he engineered the purging of the whole Yang brother network in the PLA, which was extensive. They'd been in those positions for a long time, and you really had to purge those people and bring in other people. He turned over power to Liu Huaqing and Zhang Jian, who were elderly and had no political ambitions of their own, and seemed to have really played an important role in building support within the military for Jiang Zemin. And then, luck plays a role. The elders have been interfering in Chinese politics. We talk about the so-called 8 immortals playing a vital role during the Tiananmen period. And a lot of those leaders began to fade from the scene. Li Xiannian and Hu Chaomu died in 1992. Chen Yun passed in 1995. Deng Xiaoping was certainly aging, and it became obvious that you needed to have younger leadership there. And so, the role of the retirees, of the elders, changed, diminished. And the turning point really comes in 1994-95. You have the fourth plenum in the fall of 1994, where, according to People's Daily, an editorial, power passed from the second generation of leadership to the third generation. And then in the following spring, taking advantage of his seemingly more consolidated power, Jiang got rid of Chen Shitong, the party secretary of Beijing. Getting Chen Shitong out of Beijing was not that easy. He was really a product of that Beijing machine, and it affected a lot of rice bowls. But doing so really helped consolidate power. It was not so easy to buck Jiang Zemin after that. And then, of course, there was the retirement of Chao Shi a couple of years later in 1997. This is supposedly what institutionalized politics in China, but sometimes you look at authoritarian system and institutions end up doing what the authoritarian leader wants them to do. That's not institutionalization. The institutions control other people, not the leader. If you look at the retirement of Chao Shi, it's really interesting. Chao Shi, of course, had made the Politburo years before Jiang Zemin got there. He'd run the organization department. He'd come out of the security services. There every reason to believe that he might have resented Jiang Zemin passing him over. And by his public speeches, he was really a thorn in the side of Jiang Zemin. And so as the Party Congress in 1997 came up, Jiang Zemin was able to send Weibo, who was actually one of his strong supporters, over to convince Chao Shi that it was time to retire. This was the first time retirements had been instituted in the Chinese Communist Party system. And this was very delicate. Chao Shi was 70, Jiang Zemin was 71. And nevertheless, Weibo allegedly said, well, Jiang Zemin has taken power at a time of critical need, so he can stay on despite being overage, but you need to retire. There was one other really rather good reason for moving Chao Shi out of, he was then head of the People's Congress, and that was to move Li Peng into the National People's Congress. Li Peng, of course, was deeply controversial because of his role in the Tiananmen activities, and he happened to be 69. So if you set the age at 70, it catches Chao Shi, but it doesn't catch Li Peng. And if Li Peng had just been retired after 2 terms as premier, a lot of people would have been saying, rumors that China was reassessing Tiananmen, et cetera. Politically, it would have been very, very delicate. So you move him over to the National People's Congress, a less influential position, although Li Peng held on to his number 2 ranking in the hierarchy. It's all very, very delicate moves, which just by the delicacy of these moves, you can see that institutions are not the primary moving factor here. It's the setting up the right balances. If you go on to the next slide. Yes. Moving on to Hu Jintao, who takes over as General Secretary in 2002, 16th Party Congress. Hu Jintao really was appointed by Deng Xiaoping in 1992. That's when he joined the Politburo Standing Committee. And apparently this was a decision passed by the Politburo Standing Committee. And so when Chao Shi was forced to retire, he let it be known that Hu Jintao was the successor and would be in 2002, and made it impossible for Jiang Zemin to stay on. But Jiang Zemin can do a lot of stuff to make it much more difficult for Hu Jintao to consolidate power. In 2002, the Politburo Standing Committee was expanded from 7 people to 9, and associates of Jiang Zemin were the people who expanded it. People like Huang Zhu that joined the Politburo Standing Committee. Wu Bangguo and Zhang Chunyun were added to the Secretariat. And when you move people from the Beijing and Shanghai Party Committee onto the Politburo, that opens up 2 seats, which Liu Qi and Chen Liangyu took. So you get, 4 of your associates onto the Politburo, 2 of them on the Standing Committee. And that more or less ties Hu Jintao's hands. If you're talking about controlling critical positions, it's Jiang Zemin's folks who control those critical positions. This is when Guo Buxiong and Xu Caiho were appointed vice chairs of the Central Military Commission. They held them for the entire 10 years that Hu Jintao was general secretary. So if controlling the military is an important part of holding power in China, Hu Jintao simply did not have the same sort of control that Jiang Zemin did before him. So was he really general secretary? I think that a lot of the sort of lost year talk about Hu Jintao is because leadership was really divided. You had Hu Jintao in the formal positions, but Jiang Zemin hovering above him in these, the Chinese like to call it mother-in-law position, controlling a lot of the informal politics. Next slide, please. Okay. Hu Jintao's time is over. As I say, I think that Deng Xiaoping did, in fact, try to institutionalize leadership transitions. He did not like the idea of a leader choosing his own successor, which is what he thought was the problem of concentration, centralization of power, what had happened to Mao. And so he decreed that Hu Jintao replace Jiang Zemin. This is sort of the idea of giving one faction or one wing of the party control for a while and then another one. And as I say, Cao Shi was made sure that Jiang Zemin had to stick to this arrangement. So Hu Jintao, I don't think, ever was able to centralize power. Next slide. This is where I think one can really observe the pathologies of Leninist system. It's not all organization, particularly in the Jiang Zemin period, continues very much into the Hu Jintao period. Corruption metastasizes. And, this is very interesting. I've come to believe that, why do you follow Jiang Zemin, say? Well, Jiang Zemin can allow you to become really, really rich. And many of the people, Zhou Yongkang, Xu Caiho, and so forth, apparently did become very rich. There's a tendency for decentralization and localities to build factions, which makes Beijing relatively weak. So this happens particularly with a weak and divided leadership, which is what we had in those Hu Jintao years. Next slide. And that paves the way for Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is coming in and trying to restore the party. You have to remember that when Xi Jinping came in, he was absolutely obsessed by the fall of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union and has done for 9 years everything that he can to strengthen the party and not to follow the Soviet path. He's really sort of the anti-Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping was deliberately self-effacing. Xi Jinping is high profile. Deng Xiaoping decentralized power. Xi Jinping centralizes it. Deng Xiaoping open to the West. I don't want to say Xi Jinping is close to the West, but certainly he's much more cautious about about opening to the West. Xi Jinping also, because of his anti-corruption drive, was able to consolidate power very quickly. He tried to attack factionalism, or at least other people's factions. He has promoted his own. He's stressed party building. New rules are being enunciated almost on a daily basis. And what really is interesting, I think, is the personalization of power. When you have the party now pledged to uphold what are called the two upholds, one of which is Xi Jinping as core of the party, it's a very personalized approach to power. Two members of the Politburo Standing Committee after the 19th Party Congress had never even served on the Central Committee, not as alternates or as regular members of the Central Committee. They were able to leapfrog those positions. Four members of the Politburo, not Politburo Standing Committee, but the Politburo, were promoted from the alternate list. That's jumping at least two slots. We have helicopter promotions. And so what are the implications of all this? Well, I think we're going to see one of the implications next year. It seems that Xi Jinping is going to go for a third term. There must be enormous resentments of what Xi Jinping has done in the party, certainly parts of the military, parts of the party organization. Xi Jinping has berated lower level officials for not working hard. Well, why would you work hard when you might make a mistake? It's become very difficult to do that. There's this question of personalization of power versus the power of the organization, the centralization, decentralization I mentioned. Deng Xiaoping talked about the separation of party and state. And for Xi Jinping, it's the party leads in everything. Interesting things now happening with the party and business or the economy more broadly, with the investigations of not only Didi Chuxing, but Alibaba and so forth. Very interesting what this is going to do for innovation. And I know that Scott follows issues of innovation, so maybe he can respond to some of those questions. Is he creating an environment that will allow for continued innovation? And of course, we see the continued rise of nationalism. In any case, I think I've thrown out a lot on the table, and so I'll pass it back to Jude or to Jessica or whoever is next and get some feedback. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Joe. I'm going to turn this right over to colleague and friend, comrade Scott Kennedy, who will take the discussion from here.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Jude. And Joe, thank you for being with us, for writing this terrific book. I think in my time at CSIS, this may be the fourth or fifth time that we've called upon you to enlighten us about what's going on in Chinese politics, and really a tour de force book here. And really makes all of us rethink a lot of our assumptions about how Chinese politics works. I want to bring in now Jessica Teets, who also provides amazing thought leadership on Chinese politics. And Jessica is an associate professor in political science at Middlebury College. She's also an editor with the Journal of Chinese Political Science. And she's the author of Civil Society Under Authoritarianism, The China Model, which was published in 2014, and has written and spoken on a whole range of critical issues about China, about authoritarian systems, about their relationships with civil society. And she's going to offer us her take about these big questions. And then I'll follow up with a few others. And then we will turn things over to the audience and see where that populist uprising takes us. for the remainder of the program. So Jessica, thank you for joining us. I would just say before handing you the baton that it's clear that you have already appropriately anticipated the challenges of climate change and are living in the best part of the country in Vermont compared to the rest of us. So congrats on your foresight.
Thank you, Scott. I'll check back in with you around January and see what you think then, right? So I wanted to thank both Scott and Jude for inviting me. I had Joe's book sitting on my desk and I wanted to read it, but you know how it is to find time to do that. And so having a deadline like this was great. I also wanted to acknowledge the intellectual debt that Joe references in his book to Ezra Vogel. And I think, you know, not only was Ezra Vogel a great scholar, but he also was a big proponent of this public intellectualship, right? So making sure that scholars were sharing what they know about Chinese politics with policymakers. Because first of all, this is a really important time to study Chinese politics and to try to understand what's going on. It's a time of really rapid change, and in some ways, change that isn't continuous, right? So it's harder to predict. But also, and I don't know if Joe and Jude and Scott feel the same way that I do, but sometimes I tell my students that the more you study Chinese politics, the less you feel you know. So you tell students, you know, this is how things happen, and then they do something different, and you have to try to understand why. So I learned a lot about elite politics in reading this book. This is not exactly my area. I mostly look at local governance. And so I don't have a lot to offer as far as Joe's read on elite politics and how these things are shaking out. It seems really accurate given what I know, but he also brings up some really good structural questions. And I think that those structures that he talks about, institutionalization, party politics, factions, how those play out in addition to the personalities of the people at the elite level might help us understand what's going to happen next in China and what's happening right now. So I'd like to address two of those issues. One was this idea about the value of comparison. So does it make sense to compare China to other single party systems, or should we instead think about it as unique or as a Leninist system? And the second big question is just the nature of political institutionalization. Does China have it? Do they not? What does that mean for the future? So the first question about the usefulness of comparisons with other single party systems, Joe talks a lot about this in the introduction, and he finds this category too broad and too diverse to really help understand China. And so this is why instead he uses that comparison to this sort of ideal type of a Leninist system. And I see why he's doing that, but I think that I would also push back to argue that China doesn't really fit either of these categories of a Leninist system or a single party system in the way that we might understand it in other countries. I tried to do this in my research as well and ended up just coming up with a new term of consultative authoritarianism, because China didn't exactly fit in any of the existing categories that I could have used. But I guess what I thought about that exercise was that I think that comparison actually is really profitable, because where China does look like other single party systems probably tells us something important, that there's a logic of single parties at work there, and where it doesn't fit well with how we might understand single parties to operate around the world, might get at something unique in the China context. And I think that this comparison is really profitable because it can show us, you know, what things are really important and what things maybe are normal, if you want to call it that, right? We could predict these things. So for example, when you think about promotions and demotions in the Chinese system, we know that local officials can be demoted, but they hardly ever are. And so Joe points this out in his book, and other scholars have found this as well. And this really gets at the idea of the logic of a single party, right? So Margaret Pearson and Siqi Mei wrote a really good article looking at how officials aren't demoted, they're simply moved into other positions and then they get promoted or they rise a little bit more slowly after that. So that's what demotion looks like in the Chinese system. That doesn't necessarily make sense in a purely Leninist system where you would see frequent ideological purges, but it makes a lot of sense in a single party. In a single party, what you're trying to do is channel all elite ambition through one party, right? You want the elites to stay within the party because that's where they see their future versus going outside it and challenging. And so if you don't ever demote anyone, they still have a future in the party, right? This also goes to explain why when you go to China and you meet a vice mayor, you look around for the other 12 vice mayors that are probably lurking off in the background somewhere. If you have to promote people up through a hierarchical system, you have to have lots of positions to promote them into, right? So you tend to see that sort of sprawl. So I do think that there is value in trying to compare China to other single parties within this comparative literature. I also think, though, that China has a lot to teach comparative authoritarian scholars about single party systems like what we see in China. So for example, if you think about the role of factions and how those are maintained and how those are challenged in China, this I think could actually be a really good addition to that comparative literature, which depends on patronage politics and those sorts of models, which I don't think are rigorous enough. So I would just encourage people to continue to make those comparisons and actually embrace the areas where China doesn't fit easily or might tell us something different. The bigger question, though, and I think this one's really important for everybody, not just academics, is the nature of political institutionalization. And so, as Joe pointed out, he finds that elite politics, unlike what Andy Nathan has argued, were not institutionalized. But he does find some nascent norms, like the retirement age. And this analysis, though, leads to two big questions about the nature of political institutionalization. And one is that institutionalization is a process, right? So it's not an end state, but it's a process. So institutions are always recreating rules. They're always being challenged. And so inside of institutionalization, Stephen Levitsky's work shows us that we have the rules of the game, which is what we talk about, but also these supportive norms or the connective tissue that help build out the rules. And in addition to the fact that there are both rules and norms, that this process of institutionalization is also subject to constant change and pressure, not stasis, right? So we should expect a lot of shifting, a lot of challenge during this process. And so that's one thing that we need to think about institutionalization. The other is that institutionalization might be uneven, right? So we might see that a system is better institutionalized in some places and some processes than others. And so it might make sense to talk, instead of talking about institutionalization as like an end state, it might be better to talk about it more like a spectrum. And so, for example, what I see in my research on Chinese governance is that the system is really bifurcated. So you have lower levels that really do follow the rules of the game. However, at the upper levels, where Joe's research is at elite politics, you see that there are a lot more politics and maybe less roles. What's interesting is under Xi Jinping that we see that this institutionalization below the level of elite politics is really being pushed, which leads us to this question is the system really politics all the way down? Or should we instead understand it as differing or uneven levels of institutionalization in the system? We also see that these levels of institutionalization have changed over time. And again, I don't think that this is evidence that this system is not institutionalized, but instead it's showing us a process of institutional challenge. And so this is also where that comparative authoritarian literature really helps us. So when we look at this process of norm and institution challenge, we have the people we talk about as the rule takers, the elites, the rule takers at the lower level and the rule makers, the elite. But we also have rule breakers, right? And so when we look around the world at increasing authoritarianism or even challenges in strong democracies like the US, what that's shown us is that institutions are not as strong as political scientists once thought. and that this elite consensus to break norms or rules can destroy what previously maybe we would have predicted to be stable institutions and reveal some sort of new equilibrium. So I guess what I would like to point to as future research is to try to better understand this process of institutional challenge that we're seeing with Xi Jinping. So instead of trying to decide, is the system institutionalized or not, maybe instead to ask questions also at what level, which rules and norms exist, who is challenging, where and when are the institutions more constraining, and where are they more malleable? And when we think also about, institutions as an equilibrium, what we might see is a shifting equilibrium in China. And so what might this tell us about what's happening in the system? So Milan Sfolik, who Joe brought up earlier, he might argue that this shows that Xi has amassed enough power to no longer share it with the other elites. Okay, that could be interesting, but how did that happen? So why did other elites allow this to happen and not mobilize to prevent it? Why did they let Guo Xilai be, taken out and not stop that? Why was Jiang Zemin so good at maintaining power with who, but not with Xi, right? We might see other scholars would argue that the people who study, for example, single party systems like Ben Smith or Jason Brownlee, they might argue that this represents a shift in elite consensus and that Xi had mobilized elites to support him against threats. And these threats are not inside the elite, but they're outside of the elite. And this is really important implications then for how we understand the future. So one thing that we might understand about Chinese politics is that there is increasing institutionalization, but it's bifurcated, right? So we might need different ways to understand elite politics than we do for local politics and local governance. This is also uneven throughout the bureaucracy. So there might be some departments and bureaus that are more institutionalized than others. And then about the nature of elite politics, this is going to be really challenging, right? So single party systems are really strong if they maintain elite cohesion, because then they can channel elite ambition. So given the collapse of these norms about retirement age and having 2 terms, what will this next 5 years look like? And will Xi Jinping be able to maintain that elite cohesion? So Joe's laid a really important foundation to tackle these questions, and I really learned a lot. So thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Jessica. Those are terrific insights and really helpful perspective. I wanted to offer a couple additional points to spur conversation. I think what you've laid a terrific foundation, though, and I think some of the things I'm going to say overlap a little bit with what you mentioned, although I'm going to end on a policy question as opposed to a future academic research question. The place I'm going to start, and this may sound like a unfair attack, but it's not meant to be at all. It's just about the book title, Rethinking Chinese Politics. So having been a professor for a long time through much of the period that Joe writes about, my expectation during that period is that the big shift within and the rethinking going on about Chinese politics was actually about state-society relations, and that there were sources of trajectories in China's overall political system which didn't originate from elite leaders. That in fact, in some places, they were responding to others. Not just simply setting the agenda and others reacting. So that's reflected, for example, in the work that I've done on business lobbying, Andy Murtha on protests, and authoritarian, I guess, fragmented authoritarianism 2.0, the work on civil society, some of the work as well by Jessica Chen Weiss on the complexities of nationalism and its relationship to foreign policy, things like that. So I was thinking that so having this title, Rethinking Chinese Politics, it may reflect a little bit of sort of elite politics privilege, about you're able to have a title of a book that's so broad that those of us who work on the society side of things affecting politics, we couldn't consider doing that. And so in some ways, and I want to admit that that's unfair, because everyone knows that you write about elite politics, and no one's telling you that you shouldn't write about elite politics, because that's critical. But in some ways, the book could have been titled Rethinking Chinese Elite Politics, which would have been sort of more precise. Beyond that, then we could have said, it really focuses on succession, right? So if you're going to be super precise, it would have been Rethinking Chinese Elite Political Succession. That's really the core of the book. And so that gets thrown from the cheap seats for folks who work on other parts of the system. And the second question is about institutionalization. And I agree broadly with Jessica's perspective here. Yes, there are different but I'm going to bring in a curveball at the very end, which is, so I think of institutionalization as about norms and expectations and predictability, and that it applies both to succession, transfers of power, but also about decision making for big issues, and the implementation of them, so that the participants in the process kind of have a sense of how that process is supposed to go, who the players are, and what's likely to affect the outcome. These may not be written down rules, they may be unwritten rules, but they're things that people kind of think of. And I'd also say that this isn't either or, that it's just sort of a free-for-all with no, a Hobbesian state of nature where folks are doing things in a totally unpredictable way. Even the conflict can have predictability. There's certain types of tools of power you use to crush someone else or get your point of view where you wouldn't expect it. So I wonder if we might end up somewhere more in the middle, because so many people I know in China, not just outsiders like me, have been so surprised and shocked by what Xi Jinping has done, that I've gotten so many emails and WeChat messages and other types of signals that they were just shocked when he overturned the apple cart at the 19th Party Congress and didn't appoint a vice president who was going to be the likely successor. I mean, we still got Wang Qishan. Where's Wang Qishan going, right? And so I'm wondering if it's possible that in this sort of middle space of institutionalization, Xi Jinping has really been a change agent, that if he hadn't been there, we might have had a different kind of expectation about how the interaction amongst elites work. And I think about that in the context of January 6th here in the United States and the last several years under President Trump. I think there's an expectation that there wasn't a possibility that January 6th would have led to a coup in the United States because the norms were too strong. But I think that it's not out of the world to think about the efforts that were underway to try and mobilize supporters for him that might have changed the way things turned out in January. And I think there's lots of now that institutionalization in American politics is now up for grabs. So that's just sort of one question about institutionalization. Last one is just sort of the policy takeaway. So let's just accept the outcome exactly as you've described it, that either Xi Jinping has revealed that there's not as much institutionalization as we thought, or perhaps Jessica's broken up that institutionalization and weakened it. So we're at that state. What's that mean for how long we think he can be in power, how dominant he will be, how complicated will it be for the United States and others to deal with China? Is this breakdown or revelation of lack of institutionalization, or the breakdown of institutionalization, going to make it harder for the United States and other major powers to find a constructive way to interact with China? Or might it make it easier because he, what he says goes. And so therefore, we know exactly who we need to negotiate with. He doesn't have to go back and build consensus. He can just, if he wants to change and reach a settlement he could just do it. So anyway, I'm sorry to throw a lot more on the table, but your book really is inspiring. I'm going to throw things back. Who can turn things back to you or bring in additional questions? But thanks so much.
Yeah, why don't Joe? Why don't we turn it over to you for some thoughts? But if maybe can we try and save the last 10 or so minutes? I want to get in some of the audience Q&A, but maybe take 5 or so minutes to offer some thoughts and reactions.
Well, yeah. First of all, thank you both for some very stimulating questions and thoughts. I'm Jessica. I'm all in favor of comparison. I'm also in favor of 40-hour days. Sometimes you have to choose between reading the literature on comparisons and digging deeper in China. And I tend to fall on the digging deeper side, although I don't ignore that literature entirely. It's just, boy, it's tough to do both, as I know you know. And Scott, I also have paid a lot of attention to societal issues out there. If you recall, I thought Jintao was so boring. I went and wrote a book on logic and limits of political reform in China, looking at what I thought were some really interesting efforts to deal with societal issues. And my conclusion was that those efforts to introduce just some very rudimentary intra-party democracy measures ran up against Leninist institutions. And ultimately, the party decided it wanted to keep the Leninist institutions. I think most of us with our background would say that wasn't a very good decision. You could move from a more Leninist system to a more typical authoritarian system, probably keep power, but certainly keep a better state-societal relationship. And I think that is the issue that will come up whenever Xi Jinping goes to see Marx. It will be, he's going to leave an incredible pile of issues on the table. And I think that is what people in Washington should be thinking about. One of the questions that has always fascinated me is, why is it in China's interest to pick fights with the United States? And I frame that somewhat controversially, but, where does this, we all know the Pew report that came out a few months ago that basically said nobody likes China. Their opinion of China has declined rather precipitously. This strikes me as entirely unnecessary. The so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. Why is this to China's advantage? We're used to thinking of countries advancing their own interests, national interests. And China seems to be moving in directions that don't advance its national interest. And there must be, as Jessica would point out, a political logic to this. And I have to think that political logic has something to do with both party building and power building. And that's what makes Xi Jinping so very difficult to deal with, because basically the United States would, I think, other nations as well, like to constrain him in certain norms of behavior and certain expectations. And he's saying, no, I want to go this other route. So I think he's going to be very difficult. And I think it's up to the United States to point out that these problems are not necessarily a problem of China or even of the Chinese Communist Party. The United States was able to get along with China under Jiang Zemin, Deng Xiaoping, other leaders just fine. These are problems of a particular leader. And maybe other Chinese elites will at one time or another choose to deal with those problems.
I'd like to.
I've always been an optimist.
Can I maybe to make you a pessimist for a moment, Joe? I want to ask first you, and then would love Jessica's thoughts on this as well. I'm going to start just pulling from some of the questions. One that just came in, which I think is on a lot of folks' minds, especially as we look to a third term and maybe rule in perpetuity, or at least till he sees Marx, is what would happen if this is not a Mao Zedong style slow deterioration, but rather a sudden exit of Xi Jinping via some sort of health event earlier on? What might emerge in that vacuum? And so, Joe, wanted to get your thoughts at the elite level. And then Jessica, I think a really important sub question is, how does the governance system and the party as a whole respond to this? Is there enough resiliency and integrity within the sort of base political system or the foundational political system that even if there was some volatility at the top as there's jockeying, the trains would still run on time? So maybe Joe, first to you on what would happen at the elite level in that vacuum, and then I'll turn it to Jessica.
I think that's a very difficult question. I certainly remember, as you do, back in 2012 when Xi Jinping disappeared for 2 weeks and everybody was, there were rumors of assassination attempts, hurting his back swimming. I mean, it was all over the map. And what if he'd had a heart attack and died? This was 2 months, less than 2 months before the party Congress. Boy, that party would have had real trouble sorting out elite politics. There are so many balances and interests to take care of. It would have been very, very difficult to go back to Beidai He or whatever and just reshuffle the deck, because there would be real winners and losers from that process. And certainly one of the great problems of the Mao Zedong era was that they were unable to work out major policy conflict, coming out of the Great Leap Forward and so forth. I'm not convinced that they have solved those issues. How do you deal with major elite conflict? Well, in the case of Bo Xilai, they made a decision to excise the problem. It's not a delicate process, not subtle. There are winners and losers in this system. And, if there were a major health incident or something like that, especially when power is so centralized and so personalized, I think the system would have real problems dealing with it. And I don't think that the problem is that hard to imagine them bringing in 200 Central Committee members and discussing in that large of a forum. And yet you don't have 8 immortals that can go into a room, or their secretaries go into a room and sort it out that way. So I think we're at a point where they don't have a good mechanism for sorting out precisely such issues.
Yeah, and that's just that's a great point I hadn't really thought of who would lead the discussion.
Yeah.
I don't see Li Keqiang having the street cred to drive an entire discussion of the full central committee, plus whoever else you'd need in the room from the CMC. Jessica, thoughts? I guess this is totally speculation, and it would totally depend on the scenario and what's going on, but just some base thoughts about the integrity and resiliency of the system.
Yeah, I mean, the scenario that you describe is probably the most dangerous one that China would face if you had a sudden unplanned exit. I mean, one thing is that the party is stronger now than it has been in a really long time. So I think just thinking about everyday governance, that would be fine. I think the dangerous part would be what would happen at the elite level. And so would you see the fracturing of the party into different factions that didn't even really try to pretend that they were in the same party, and that sort of jockeying for power? I think that we might instead see what happened after Mao Zedong's death, where you bring somebody in who nobody likes, but nobody dislikes, right? You sort of bring somebody in who is just a placeholder, and everybody knows that that's the role. And then with that person in power, then you would see that everybody would have to talk behind the scenes. But it will be really interesting, because the way that you would pick that successor would be different than what we've seen in the past, because Xi Jinping Jinping has done a really good job in breaking down the power of the factions at the local level. And so before, you would have stability by making sure that you alternated between different factions, somebody as the president, somebody as the vice president. But if you don't have that mechanism of making sure that all elites feel that their ambitions are being met and that they have a path forward, then it becomes this zero-sum competition for the top slot. And that's what we see in other single-party systems that make it so dangerous, that lead to, coup attempts and assassinations and all of those sorts of politics. So I think it would be a really dangerous time. But I do think that the party is much more cohesive and stronger than it has been in the past. And that might be a factor to help prevent that outcome.
Scott, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, obviously things could go totally haywire. And in Chinese politics, the general rule is you look up, right, to decide what you're supposed to do, right? Whether it's a bureaucrat or your faction leader or something like that. But I want to posit the other possibility that Italy or Thailand could be China's future. Italy and Thailand have very unstable elite politics, right? Yet their bureaucracies work relatively seamlessly, regardless of what's going on at the very top. You can travel to Italy or Thailand, which I've done, at least to Thailand, in the middle of a coup, and the rest of the system operates. And it's possible that the norms that Jessica described with regard to the base and the bifurcation may still run relatively normally, even with that stuff going on at top. I don't know. I think it's a fabulous question. It's the big question, of course, but I think we ought to think about the range of potential outcomes.
We only have about 4 minutes left, so I'm going to see if we can get a round robin in. I'll just go quickly through the three of you. Again, these are all speculative questions, but that makes it fun because our answers are unfalsifiable, hopefully, over the near term. Does Xi Jinping, this is a great question, does Xi Jinping recognize the risks of personalization? Are there any signs that he is taking, this is now my editorialization of the question, are there any signs that he is taking steps to mitigate some of the known problems of power centralization and personalization? Or do you just, when you get that powerful, you become so blind, Acton's power corrupts absolutely? I'll go around the room here. Joe?
Boy, we haven't seen it. Jessica just said the party is more powerful than ever, and it seems that way, but they're doing all sorts of things, controlling the hours that kids can play on video games, trying to put some form of Xi Jinping thought into the school curriculum. It seems to me that the party is scared of any sort of thing that it doesn't immediately control. I just think they're setting themselves up for some really big problems. I just want to throw out one book, Scott Rozell's Invisible China, wonderful book. And he points out that the model of growth is at an end. China's got to find new ways of growing. And if it doesn't, some of the economic outcomes could be disastrous. So in addition to your question, Jude, about health incidents, really major economic upsets, I think would really shake up the system. And maybe it would provide other people in the system to say, Xi Jinping hasn't been doing such a great job. So, economics and personalization of power, I just see a slew of problems confronting China in the future.
Jessica, final closing thoughts here?
I don't think that he thinks about the personalization or centralization as a problem yet, because I think he still sees so many areas where they don't have as much control as they would like at the central level. And I also think he still worries about the presence of factions. He's done a really good job in eliminating them and having everyone sort of loyal to the center. But I think he doesn't think that he's quite finished yet. I think this also, though, points to a really important lesson for US policymakers, which is that we're always looking for allies within the system. People who are being quiet right now because they're afraid of Xi Jinping, but really they agree with us, and we just need to empower them, and then policy will shift. And I see a lot of elite consensus that Xi Jinping has correctly identified the threats to the party, that he's correctly identified the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that he's finally tackling problem areas that people have seen for a long time. So I don't get the sense that there are a lot of really powerful people who are still in the party who disagree with him. And so that search for allies might not be really useful. And it might be better instead to identify pragmatic policy overlaps where what Xi Jinping wants to solve is a problem we also want to solve. And that's where we may be able to work together.
Scott, final thoughts, and then maybe I could ask you to just close us out.
Sure. I think the solution that he settled on for this problem is Orwell. That is AI, data. If you can't depend on folks to tell you honestly the truth and help you really figure out those problems and where the mistakes are, well, you use the social credit system. You use other ways to track folks, monitor people. You don't let two Politburo members get in a room by themselves. You make sure you've got asymmetrically more information than everyone else. So I think this turns around about information and data as his backstop to try and square the circle. And of course, there is garbage in, garbage out problem in any kinds of data, and so it doesn't necessarily protect him from that kind of problem. What we found is that the trajectory of Chinese politics is unpredictable, and we know our study of Chinese politics is institutionalized, that we have great folks in leadership like from Joe and Jessica, but the trajectory of the system is going to be hard to fathom. But Joe has given us a really good pathway to think about these challenges, and Jessica has also offered some ways to further try and map out the complexities of the system, where it may be institutionalized, where it may not, and why, which is important both for academics and for policymakers. And of course, it's most important for folks in China. So we are going to continue to be watching very carefully. I want to thank my co-host and partner in crime, Jude, and his team in the Freeman Chair, my team in the Trustee Chair for doing a great job in collaborating, to Joe and Jessica for inspiring us with their work today and every day, and for all of you watching at home or wherever you find yourselves. Thank you for your comments, reactions, and for participating in this program. I hope everybody has a terrific day. Take care.
Thank you.